A general who has never lost a battle, who seems to vanish like smoke when his enemies look for him, who defeats his opponents before a single sword is drawn. This is the figure that emerges from the mists of ancient China. A man named Sun Tzu, whose wisdom about war and strategy has outlasted empires and continues to guide leaders, military officers, and strategists more than 2,500 years after his death. His book, The Art of War, written so long ago that no one is entirely certain which century witnessed its creation, remains the most widely studied and quoted military treatise in human history, consulted equally by generals planning campaigns and by business executives crafting corporate strategy. In offices in New York and Tokyo, in military academies in Europe and America, in boardrooms and strategic planning sessions across the globe, leaders still turn to Sun Tzu's ancient wisdom to inform their decisions. Yet despite his enormous influence and the fame of his teachings, Sun Tzu himself remains profoundly mysterious. Figure who appears briefly in history, leaves us a remarkable text, and then seems to disappear like the very strategies he advocated. Victory without trace, influence without visibility, wisdom that transforms the world while remaining almost invisible. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. To understand Sun Tzu, we must first understand the world in which he lived and the traditions from which he emerged. The China of Sun Tzu's era was a land in constant turmoil, a fragmented realm divided into numerous states and kingdoms, each vying for supremacy, each convinced of its own moral and cultural superiority, yet each vulnerable to the military prowess of its neighbors. This was the period known as the Warring States, a time of tremendous conflict and also tremendous creativity, when warfare was constantly evolving and when military innovation could determine the fate of kingdoms. It was an era that demanded new thinking about strategy, tactics, and the very nature of warfare itself. During this period, the old feudal systems that had characterized earlier Chinese civilization were breaking down. The power of the central Zhou court had become increasingly nominal. Real power rested with the various states, some large and powerful, some small and vulnerable. These states engaged in constant diplomatic maneuvering, forming alliances and breaking them, fighting wars that were sometimes devastating in their scale, and sometimes merely skirmishes between rival powers. It was an era of transition, when the old ways were being superseded by new ways, when tradition clashed with innovation, when the very fabric of civilization seemed to be in flux. The history of Sun Tzu is shrouded in uncertainty and contradiction. The basic facts of his life are known, yet much remains obscure, debated by scholars who have spent lifetimes studying the sparse historical records that have survived the centuries. Different ancient texts give different accounts. Different scholars interpret the available evidence in different ways. What is generally accepted by most historians is that Sun Tzu was born sometime in the 6th century before Christ, in the state of Wu, located in what is now the Jiangsu province of southeastern China. This was a period when China as a unified entity did not exist. Instead, the geographical region we call China was divided into numerous competing states. Some were powerful and controlled large territories. Others were small and vulnerable. Each state had its own government, its own military forces, and its own ambitions for power and dominance. The state of Wu was one of these powerful states, known throughout the region for its naval prowess and its complex military traditions. Wu had access to rivers and water routes, which meant that water-based warfare was an important part of the state's military capabilities. Wu also had a long military tradition and a sophisticated aristocratic culture that valued military excellence and strategic thinking. Sun Tzu's family background is somewhat obscure, but most historical sources suggest that he came from the military aristocracy of Wu. His family had a tradition of military service and military thinking. His ancestors had served as officers and strategists in the armies of Wu. This heritage of military service and strategic thought would have been the foundation of Sun Tzu's education and worldview. From childhood, he would have been immersed in discussions of warfare, military tactics, and the philosophy of conflict. He would have studied the campaigns of past generals and learned the lessons that history offered about victory and defeat. His family would have trained him in weapons and horsemanship, as was typical for the sons of military families in Wu. His family would also have educated him in the classics of Chinese philosophy and literature, ensuring that he had a broad intellectual foundation. We can infer certain things about Sun Tzu's early life from what we know about the education of military aristocrats in Wu during this period. Boys from such families were trained from an early age in weapons, swords, spears, and bows. They learned horsemanship, learning to ride and fight from horseback. They learned the basics of military formation and organization. They studied the writings of earlier military strategists and philosophers. They were expected to understand not just how to fight, but why to fight, not just tactics, but strategy, not just immediate military objectives, but larger political goals. Sun Tzu's intellectual formation was influenced by the broader Chinese philosophical tradition of his era. This was the period when Confucianism was developing, when Taoism was emerging as a philosophical force, when various schools of thought were competing for influence and followers. Some scholars suggest that Sun Tzu was influenced by Taoist philosophy, with its emphasis on flowing with natural forces rather than trying to impose artificial order, with its valuation of subtle influence over direct confrontation. This possible Taoist influence would help explain some of the distinctive characteristics of Sun Tzu's approach to warfare, his emphasis on deception, his preference for avoiding direct confrontation, his valuation of subtle psychological advantage over brute force. During Sun Tzu's youth, China underwent enormous changes and experienced periods of relative stability followed by renewed conflict. The different states engaged in constant diplomatic maneuvering, forming alliances and breaking them, fighting wars that were sometimes devastating in their human costs, and sometimes merely skirmishes between rival powers. The military technology of the era was evolving rapidly. Chariots, which had dominated warfare in earlier Chinese history, were gradually being supplemented and eventually replaced by infantry formations. Bronze and early iron weapons were being refined and improved continuously. Bronze swords were being made stronger and sharper. Spears were being modified for greater effectiveness. Bows were being improved to allow for longer range and greater accuracy. Military organization was becoming more sophisticated. Generals were learning to coordinate multiple units, to create tactics that involved the coordinated movement of different types of forces, to think about warfare in more strategic and systematic ways. It was in this context of military evolution and constant warfare that Sun Tzu developed his revolutionary understanding of warfare. He was not unique in his era. Other military strategists and thinkers emerged during this period of Chinese history. Many states employed military advisors and strategists. Many of these men wrote down their thoughts about warfare and strategy. But Sun Tzu was different in the profundity of his thinking, in the systematic way he approached military problems, and in his ability to articulate principles that could be applied across different contexts and situations. Where other military theorists might focus on specific tactics or specific weapons or specific formations, Sun Tzu sought to understand the underlying principles of warfare, the fundamental patterns that determined victory and defeat, the basic principles that remained constant across different situations. The most important event in Sun Tzu's life, the event that brought him from relative obscurity to prominence and recognition, was his meeting with the king of Wu. According to the historical records, which may be somewhat embellished by later storytellers, but which likely contain a kernel of historical truth, Sun Tzu was living in relative obscurity when he was discovered by a wise minister or advisor in the court of the king of Wu. This advisor, recognizing in Sun Tzu a brilliant military mind and understanding that such a mind could be valuable to the state, brought Sun Tzu to the attention of the king. The king, intrigued by reports of this extraordinary strategic thinker, and curious to test whether the reports were accurate, invited Sun Tzu to his court and requested that Sun Tzu demonstrate his military knowledge and abilities. What happened next, according to the historical accounts, is one of the most famous stories in military history, and serves to illustrate not only Sun Tzu's military genius, but also his absolute commitment to discipline and principle. Sun Tzu was invited to drill the king's concubines as soldiers, to demonstrate his ability to organize and command military forces and to transform them into a disciplined unit. This was partly a test of Sun Tzu's abilities, and partly a display if Sun Tzu could take these women, who were accustomed to luxury and palace life, who had no military experience whatsoever, who had been trained for entertaining the king and bearing his children rather than for warfare, and could somehow transform them into a non-organized military unit capable of following orders and executing formations, it would prove conclusively that his methods of command and organization were truly effective. The king provided Sun Tzu with 180 of his concubines, divided into 2 companies. The 2 most senior concubines, the ones who held the highest status and were the king's favorites, were designated as company commanders. This was significant. The king was placing his most favored companions in positions of authority under Sun Tzu's command. Sun Tzu began by explaining the orders and the signals that would be used in military drills. He taught the women the basic formations and movements. He explained the importance of discipline and coordination. He told them that though he was training them in what might seem like a humorous context, a game or a show for the king's amusement, the principles he was teaching were the same serious principles that governed real warfare and real military organization. Discipline in military affairs was not a matter of preference or individual choice. It was absolute. When a general gave an order, it must be obeyed. When a signal was given, all soldiers must respond immediately. Failure to obey was not a minor matter. It was a violation of the fundamental principles that allowed an army to function. Once he had explained his orders and his expectations clearly, making absolutely certain that the concubines understood what was being asked of them, and what the consequences of disobedience would be, Sun Tzu gave the signal for the women to begin their exercises. But as he gave the signal, the women began to giggle and laugh, finding the situation amusing rather than serious. They had been chosen for their beauty and charm, not for their willingness to accept military discipline. They did not take the exercise seriously. They did not execute the formations he had ordered. They did not respond to his commands with discipline. Instead, they laughed and whispered to each other, treating the whole affair as a sort of game or entertainment. Sun Tzu paused. He did not laugh. He did not join in the amusement. Instead, he recognized what had happened. He had given explicit orders. The women had been told what was expected of them, and they had deliberately disobeyed. Furthermore, they had shown disrespect to their commander. According to military discipline and military law principles that had been understood and accepted in Chinese military tradition, for centuries disobedience and disrespect required punishment. The punishment, according to military law, was death, but not for all the disobedient soldiers. The responsibility for discipline within a unit falls primarily on the officers, the commanders of that unit. The senior concubines, designated as company commanders, bore the primary responsibility for maintaining discipline in their companies. They had failed to maintain discipline. They had set a poor example for the other women in their companies. They had allowed disorder and disrespect to occur. They were responsible. Sun Tzu reported this to the king, explaining that according to military law and military discipline, the 2 senior concubines, the ones designated as company commanders, must be executed as punishment for their failure to maintain discipline in their units. The king was shocked and disturbed by this recommendation. These were not soldiers. They were his beloved concubines. They were not criminals who deserved execution. They were women in his household. He ordered Sun Tzu to stop and to release the concubines immediately. He said that he did not want them to be executed. He asked Sun Tzu to continue with the training, but to spare the 2 senior concubines from this extreme punishment. Sun Tzu respectfully but firmly explained that he could not countermand his own orders or change the punishment he had announced. If he did so, if he allowed his orders to be violated without enforcing the consequences he had stated would follow, then discipline would be meaningless. If a commander could be overruled by the king or by pressure from above, then the commander's authority would be undermined. Soldiers would know that if they disobeyed, they might not face punishment if they could appeal to higher authority or find allies to intercede on their behalf. This would make it impossible for any commander to maintain discipline in an army. Furthermore, Sun Tzu explained, if he were to allow this exception, if he were to spare the 2 commanders because they were concubines and because the king favored them, then what message would this send to the other women in the exercise? It would tell them that discipline only applied to some people, not to others. It would tell them that the consequences announced for disobedience were not truly serious. It would guarantee that they would not take any orders seriously. The entire structure of military discipline would collapse. Therefore, Sun Tzu concluded he could not compromise on this matter. The 2 senior concubines must be executed. If the king wished to stop the exercise entirely, the king had the authority to do so. The king could order Sun Tzu to stop training the concubines and could send Sun Tzu away. But if the king allowed the training to continue, then military discipline must be maintained, and that discipline required the execution of the commanders who had failed to maintain order in their units. The king faced this dilemma. He could stop the entire exercise and dismiss Sun Tzu, but this would mean admitting that he did not trust Sun Tzu's methods and rejecting the military instruction he had requested. He could allow the executions to proceed, but this meant sacrificing 2 of his favorite concubines, women he cared for. It was a genuine conflict between military necessity and personal attachment. After a moment of internal struggle, the king made his decision. He allowed Sun Tzu to proceed. The executions took place. The 2 senior concubines, who had been so favored by the king, were executed for their failure to maintain discipline. What followed next was remarkable. Sun Tzu then reorganized the women into 2 new companies with new commanders selected from among the remaining concubines. He explained the orders and the expectations again, perhaps with even greater emphasis, now that the women understood that the threat of execution was not mere rhetoric, but was truly serious. He gave the signal for them to execute the formations. This time, without exception, the women responded with complete obedience and precision. The formations were executed perfectly. The women moved as one unified body, responding instantly to signals and commands. Each woman understood exactly what was expected of her and performed it flawlessly. The demonstration was complete and perfect. The king watched this display with a complex mixture of emotions. He was impressed by the immediate and dramatic result. The women had been transformed from a laughing, undisciplined group into a precise, obedient military unit. But he was also disturbed by the harshness of Sun Tzu's methods and the uncompromising nature of his approach to discipline. He had just witnessed the execution of 2 of his concubines. Yet the king was wise enough to recognize that he was in the presence of a military genius, a man who understood something profound about warfare and command that went beyond mere technical knowledge of military tactics. He understood that what had been demonstrated was not just the training of the concubines, but a fundamental principle of military success. Discipline is absolute. Without discipline, an army is just a mob of individuals. With discipline, even untrained civilians can be organized into an effective military force. The king appointed Sun Tzu as a general in his army and gave him command of the state of Wu's military forces. This appointment was transformative for both Sun Tzu and for the state of Wu. For the next several years, Sun Tzu served as the supreme military commander of Wu, serving under the authority of the king, but with broad authority over military matters. During this period, he revolutionized the state's military organization, implementing new training methods, developing more sophisticated tactical formations, improving the coordination between different units, and establishing new systems of command and communication. Under Sun Tzu's leadership, the military forces of Wu were transformed. They became renowned throughout the region for their discipline, their organization, and their effectiveness. Soldiers who had previously been somewhat undisciplined became precise and coordinated. Officers who had previously focused primarily on individual combat prowess were trained to think about tactics and strategy. The state of Wu, which had been a significant but not dominant power in the region, suddenly became a major military force to be reckoned with, a power that other states had to take seriously. Sun Tzu led the forces of Wu in several campaigns against neighboring states. These campaigns demonstrated the superiority of his military organization and tactics. One of the most famous of these campaigns was against the state of Sichu, one of the largest and most powerful states in the region. The state of Sichu was in many ways far more powerful than Wu on paper. It had larger territory, greater resources, and a larger population from which to draw soldiers. It had a long military tradition and experienced commanders. In any conventional assessment of military power, Sichu should have been able to defeat Wu. Yet when Wu, under Sun Tzu's command, marched against Sichu, the result was a stunning victory for Wu and a humiliation for Sichu. The way Sun Tzu achieved this victory demonstrates his revolutionary approach to warfare. Rather than meeting the Sichu forces in direct confrontation and relying simply on superior discipline and organization, to overcome superior numbers, Sun Tzu used something far more sophisticated. He used deception, misdirection, and psychological warfare. He sent out scouts and spies to gather intelligence about the Sichu forces and their positions, their supplies, their morale, the competence of their commanders. He used false signals and false information to confuse the Sichu commanders about the size and location of the Wu forces. He maneuvered his armies in ways that made it difficult for the Sichu commanders to understand what was happening or to respond effectively. He made his forces appear to be in positions where they were not. He made small forces appear large through the use of banners and dust clouds and false encampments. He made large forces appear small by moving them secretly. When the armies finally engaged in direct combat, it was on terrain that Sun Tzu had chosen because it favored his forces, at a time that advantaged the Wu soldiers over the Sichu soldiers, and in circumstances where the Wu soldiers had the psychological advantage. The Sichu forces, confused and demoralized by the maneuvering that had preceded the battle, did not fight with their usual effectiveness. They were uncertain about where the enemy was, uncertain about the size of the enemy forces, uncertain about what was happening. They had been worn down by the maneuvering and the psychological pressure that preceded the battle. By the time actual combat occurred, much of the psychological advantage had already been won by Wu. The Wu forces, disciplined and confident under their general's command, well rested because Sun Tzu had ensured they were not unnecessarily fatigued, fought with superior coordination and organization. The Sichu forces were disorganized and demoralized. The battle resulted in a decisive victory for Wu and a significant defeat for Sichu. Sichu was forced to submit to Wu's terms, to acknowledge Wu's superior power, and in some accounts, to cede territory to Wu as compensation for the war. This victory and others, like it, established Sun Tzu's reputation as perhaps the greatest military strategist of his era. Stories of his victories spread throughout the various Chinese states. Merchants and travelers carried tales of this remarkable general from Wu, who seemed to defeat his enemies through mysterious means, who did not rely primarily on numbers but on intelligence and strategy. Other rulers wanted to employ him as a general. His methods were studied and emulated by other military commanders who heard about his successes. His name became legendary. In the courts of other states, advisors and ministers began to urge their rulers to either make peace with Wu or to acquire the services of a strategist as brilliant as Sun Tzu. It was during this period of success, when Sun Tzu was at the height of his influence and power, when his reputation seemed unassailable and his victories seemed inevitable, that he undertook the project that would ensure his immortal legacy and that would eventually influence leaders and thinkers across centuries and cultures. He wrote The Art of War. The exact date of composition remains uncertain, subject to scholarly debate and speculation. Some scholars believe it was written early in his career, when his ideas were first forming, and he wanted to capture them before they were lost. Others believe it was written late in his life, when he had accumulated decades of military experience and wisdom, and he wanted to share his accumulated understanding with future generations. Still others believe it was written after his death by his followers or students, who collected his teachings and organized them into the systematic treatise that has come down to us. Some scholars have even suggested, based on certain textual characteristics, that different sections may have been written at different times and by different hands, and that The Art of War, as we know, it may be a composite work created over centuries, rather than the work of a single author writing at a single time. But the general consensus among most scholars is that the core of The Art of War was written sometime during Sun Tzu's period of active service as a general, probably during the prime of his life, when his ideas were most fully formed and his experience most extensive, when he had accumulated enough victories and enough experience to see patterns in warfare that others might miss. Whether he wrote it all at once or in sections over time, whether he wrote it himself or had scribes record his teachings, whether the text we have today is exactly what he wrote or has been modified and edited over the centuries, these details remain uncertain. What is certain is that the text represents a coherent and brilliant philosophy of warfare, and that this philosophy is attributed to Sun Tzu and reflects his thinking and his approach to military strategy. The Art of War is a relatively short book, only about 5,000 words in most modern translations, which means it is shorter than many magazine articles, yet it contains more insight and wisdom about warfare than many texts many times longer. It is organized into 13 sections, each dealing with a different aspect of military strategy and warfare. The sections are typically titled Laying Plans, Waging War, Attack, Tactical Dispositions, Energy, Weak Points and Strong Points, Maneuvering, Variation in Tactics, the Use of Spies, Terrain, the 9 Situations, the Attack by Fire, and the Use of Spies. Note that some translations combine or reorganize these sections slightly differently. Despite being organized into distinct sections, the book is not simply a collection of disconnected thoughts or aphorisms. Rather, it presents a unified and coherent philosophy of warfare based on certain fundamental principles that recur throughout the work. The central philosophical insight of The Art of War is deceptively simple, yet profoundly revolutionary for the context of Sun Tzu's era. Victory in war is not primarily determined by the size of your army, the quantity of your weapons, the quality of your equipment, or the individual courage and martial prowess of your soldiers. Instead, victory is determined by superior strategy, superior intelligence, superior positioning, superior understanding of circumstances, and superior psychological advantage. A general who understands these principles, Sun Tzu argues, can defeat a much larger force. A general who ignores these principles can be defeated by a much smaller force. The best general is not necessarily the one who wins the most battles or who conquers the most territory. The best general is the one who achieves his objective with the minimum expenditure of resources and the minimum loss of life. The perfect general, the most complete expression of strategic excellence, is the general who defeats his enemy without fighting, who achieves victory through superior positioning, superior logistics, and superior psychological pressure, such that the enemy is forced to surrender or withdraw before the armies even engage in direct combat. This concept was revolutionary in the context of Sun Tzu's era and remains profoundly important and valuable today. In most ancient and medieval warfare traditions, the culture of honor and martial prowess meant that armies did actually fight directly with each other. That victory was achieved through personal courage, physical strength, and skill in close combat. There was honor in fighting, and there was shame in avoiding combat. The greatest warriors were those known for their prowess in battle. A general's reputation depended partly on his victories, but also on his demonstrated courage and fighting ability. Sun Tzu's suggestion that the greatest general was the one who avoided unnecessary fighting seemed to many of his contemporaries to be cowardly or dishonorable. It seemed to violate the warrior code that many ancient cultures held sacred. Yet Sun Tzu understood something that many military leaders throughout history have failed to grasp, that winning with the fewest casualties among your own forces, with the least damage to your own equipment and infrastructure, with the quickest and most decisive outcome, is superior to any victory achieved through prolonged and costly fighting. A victory purchased at the cost of half your army is not as good as a victory purchased at the cost of a tenth of your army. A victory achieved in one season is better than a victory achieved after years of warfare. A victory achieved through psychological pressure without battles is better than a victory achieved through multiple costly battles. Sun Tzu begins The Art of War with a section on laying plans, which emphasizes the crucial importance of thorough preparation and careful analysis before any military campaign begins. He identifies 5 constant factors that must be considered in any military enterprise: moral law, heaven, earth, commander, and method and discipline. The moral law refers to the alignment of the ruler with the people. A ruler who acts in accordance with justice and morality will have the loyalty and support of the people and the soldiers. A ruler who acts unjustly or tyrannically will have a discontented and disloyal population. This matters because an army is ultimately drawn from the population, and soldiers who serve a just ruler whom they respect will fight with greater motivation than soldiers who serve an unjust ruler whom they despise. Heaven refers to natural factors like weather, climate, seasonal changes, and other natural conditions that can affect military operations. An army that understands weather patterns and can use them to advantage has an enormous benefit. An army that must march in the wrong season or that fails to account for weather will suffer greatly. A general who understands heaven and can work with it rather than against it gains significant advantage. Earth refers to terrain, distance, and geography. Different types of terrain favor different types of military operations. Some terrain favors cavalry, other terrain favors infantry. Some terrain is suitable for siege warfare. Other terrain is suitable for mobile operations. Distance affects logistics. Armies that must travel far from their supply lines are at disadvantage compared to armies close to their supplies. A general who understands terrain and uses it to advantage can defeat a general who ignores terrain. Geography matters because some locations are naturally defensible. Others are naturally vulnerable. The commander refers to the qualities and abilities of the military leader. The commander must possess certain qualities: wisdom to make good decisions, courage to take necessary risks, benevolence toward his soldiers so they will follow him willingly, strictness in discipline so that orders are obeyed, and decisiveness in judgment so that decisions are made and acted upon rather than endlessly debated. Method and discipline refer to the organization of the army and the enforcement of rules and procedures. An organized army with clear command structures and clear procedures can accomplish far more than a disorganized rabble. An army where discipline is enforced will obey orders reliably. An army where discipline is absent will disobey orders and fall into chaos. Sun Tzu argues that a careful assessment of these 5 factors, combined with knowledge of your own army and knowledge of the enemy's army, will allow a commander to predict the outcome of a campaign before it begins. If the assessment shows that victory is probable, then the campaign should be undertaken. If the assessment shows that defeat is probable, then the campaign should be avoided, no matter how much political pressure there is to fight. A wise general, Sun Tzu argues, will refuse to fight a battle that he assesses will result in defeat, even if refusing to fight damages his reputation or engages the ruler who commands him. This emphasis on careful analysis and prediction before action was revolutionary in an era when many military decisions were made based on impulse, on the desire for glory, on the wishes of the ruler without careful analysis, or on the demands of honor. Sun Tzu is arguing that military decisions should be based on rational analysis of the factors that determine victory and defeat. This emphasis on rationality and analysis remains one of the most important contributions of Sun Tzu's thinking. In the section on waging war, Sun Tzu emphasizes the importance of logistics, the supply of food, weapons, and other necessities to an army in the field. He argues that protracted warfare is damaging to a state and to its economy. Soldiers who are away from their homes are not productive in agriculture or other necessary occupations. Resources spent on warfare are resources not available for other purposes. A state at war cannot conduct business as usual. Trade is disrupted. Production is disrupted. Resources are diverted to military purposes. Therefore, he argues, a general should seek to end wars quickly. This means adequate preparation and training before the campaign begins, sufficient supplies gathered before the campaign begins to support the army in the field without requiring resupply from the home state, and tactical decisions designed to bring the campaign to a rapid conclusion. Sun Tzu goes so far as to argue that an ideal campaign should be completed quickly, a matter of weeks or a few months, not years. Extended campaigns wear down the army, damage the economy, and create opportunities for unexpected events to disrupt the campaign. This emphasis on logistics and on the economic costs of warfare was far ahead of his time. He understood that an army is not just a collection of individual warriors, but is an organization that requires supplies, coordination, and careful planning. An army's ability to move, fight, and sustain itself depends on the quality of its logistical support. Many generals of Sun Tzu's era and of later eras focused primarily on tactics and on battlefield maneuvers, while giving insufficient attention to the logistical challenges of keeping an army supplied in the field. They assumed that supplies could be obtained locally by foraging or by requisitioning from the population. But Sun Tzu understood that foraging is unreliable and that taking supplies by force from the local population breeds resentment and resistance. The best approach is to bring supplies from home, to plan carefully how much is needed, and to organize the supply chain efficiently. In the section on attack, Sun Tzu makes his famous argument that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. He argues that the best victories are achieved when the enemy is forced to surrender without actual combat. How is this achieved? Through superior positioning, through controlling key terrain and resources, through making it clear to the enemy that resistance is hopeless while offering an honorable path to surrender. The general who can achieve this, who can force the enemy to yield without the necessity of battle, is truly supreme in his art. This principle challenges everything that many military cultures hold dear. It seems to suggest that avoiding combat is superior to achieving a glorious victory in battle. Yet Sun Tzu's reasoning is clear. Even a victory achieved through battle involves casualties among your own forces, damage to your own equipment, disruption of your own economy, and resources spent that could have been preserved. If you can achieve the same objective without these costs, then doing so is obviously superior. A dead soldier is lost whether he dies in a glorious victory or in an unnecessary battle. A destroyed weapon cannot be easily replaced. A disrupted economy takes years to recover. All of these costs can be avoided if victory can be achieved through superior strategy rather than through battle. Sun Tzu distinguishes between different levels of victory, arranged in order of preference from best to worst. The best is to win without fighting, to achieve your objective through positioning, through controlling key resources, through psychological pressure, without ever engaging in direct combat. The next best is to win by breaking the enemy's alliances and unity, to isolate the enemy by turning his allies against him, or by causing divisions within his own camp. The third best is to defeat the enemy in battle, to actually fight and win through superior organization and tactics. And the worst is to assault walled cities, to conduct a siege, or to try to assault fortified positions, which is costly, time-consuming, and risky. Each level of victory requires greater cost and effort than the previous level. To win without fighting requires the least expenditure of resources. To win by breaking alliances requires more resources, but still less than winning through battle. To win through battle requires significant resources and significant casualties. To assault walled cities requires enormous resources, enormous casualties, and enormous time. Therefore, a wise general should always seek to achieve victory at the highest level possible through superior strategy, positioning, and intelligence, while avoiding the necessity of costly battles if possible. In the section on tactical dispositions, Sun Tzu discusses how a general should position his forces to achieve maximum advantage. He emphasizes that a general should know his own army thoroughly, should understand its strengths and weaknesses in detail, should understand which soldiers are the best fighters and which are less skilled, should understand which officers are the most reliable and which are less dependable, and should position his forces in ways that maximize their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. He should also seek to understand the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and should try to position his forces in ways that exploit the enemy's weaknesses while avoiding the enemy's strengths. Sun Tzu uses a metaphor from nature to explain his approach. Like water that flows around obstacles rather than trying to crash through them, a good general should move his forces in ways that take advantage of natural and created advantages. If the enemy is positioned on high ground, the general should not attack them directly, trying to charge uphill against defenders who have the advantage of elevation. Instead, the general should try to cut off the enemy's supplies, or maneuver to force them to come down from their position, or find alternative approaches that don't require a direct assault on the fortified position. If the enemy is in a strong fortified position, surrounded by walls, the general should not attempt to assault the fortifications directly, which would result in enormous casualties. Instead, the general should try to make the position untenable through siege, by cutting off supplies, by surrounding the position with an overwhelming force, and making it clear that surrender is the only way out, or by other means that don't require a direct assault. This is the principle of moving like water, finding the path of least resistance, rather than trying to force your way directly through obstacles. The section on energy discusses how a general should use the momentum and morale of his army. Sun Tzu argues that an army with high morale, fighting with proper momentum and confidence, can accomplish great things even if it is numerically smaller than an enemy army with low morale and poor confidence. Conversely, an army with poor morale, even if it is numerically larger, will be defeated by an army fighting with superior morale and momentum. This might seem obvious to modern readers, but it was an important insight in the context of Sun Tzu's era, when many commanders believed that victory was primarily a matter of numbers. Therefore, maintaining and building the morale of one's own army while trying to demoralize the enemy is a crucial part of military strategy. A general should ensure that his troops are well-fed, well-supplied, well-trained, well-led, and respected. Soldiers who feel that they are being taken care of, who have confidence in their general, who believe that victory is possible, will fight with far greater effectiveness than soldiers who are starving, who distrust their general, who believe that defeat is likely. Similarly, a general should work to demoralize the enemy spreading false information about the size of his own forces or about the weakness of his own forces to make the enemy either overconfident and therefore careless, or fearful and therefore hesitant. In the section on weak points and strong points, Sun Tzu discusses how a general should concentrate his forces at the enemy's weak points while avoiding the enemy's strong points. He argues that an army that is spread out trying to defend everywhere is weak everywhere. Every part of the line is relatively weak because the troops are thinly spread. An army concentrated at a few key points can be very strong at those points. A good general should identify the enemy's weak points through intelligence gathering and then concentrate his forces to strike at those weak points. By achieving local superiority at key locations, the general can defeat a numerically superior enemy. If the enemy has concentrated forces in one location, then other parts of the enemy's territory may be lightly defended. The clever general will strike at these lightly defended areas, forcing the enemy to divide his forces to defend everywhere, which will weaken the enemy's overall position. A section on maneuvering discusses how a general should move his forces in the field to maintain flexibility and to avoid being trapped or outmaneuvered by the enemy. Sun Tzu argues that a general should keep his true intentions hidden from the enemy, should use deception and false information to confuse the enemy about his real plans, and should be prepared to change direction or change tactics quickly if circumstances change. An army that moves along a predictable path is vulnerable. An enemy that understands where you are going can prepare an ambush or can move forces to oppose you. But an army that moves unpredictably, that changes direction when the enemy least expects it, that uses false information to make the enemy uncertain about its intentions, is very hard to trap or predict. The section on variation in tactics emphasizes that a good general must be flexible and must adapt his tactics to the specific circumstances of each situation. There are no universal tactics that work in all situations. Instead, the general must understand the basic principles of warfare and then apply them intelligently to the specific terrain, enemy, and circumstances of each particular campaign. A tactic that works well in open ground may not work well in mountainous terrain. A tactic that works well against a disciplined enemy may not work well against a less organized enemy. A general who is rigidly committed to a particular set of tactics, who tries to apply the same approach regardless of circumstances, will eventually encounter a situation where his tactics do not work and will be defeated. But a general who understands the principles underlying tactics and can adapt those principles to different situations will succeed. The section on the use of spies discusses the importance of intelligence gathering. Sun Tzu identifies 5 types of spies: local spies who are drawn from the enemy's own population and who can provide information about local conditions; inside spies who are enemy officials or commanders who have been turned to work for you and who can provide information about the enemy's plans; double spies, who are enemy spies who have been turned to work for you and who can provide information about what the enemy believes about you and what the enemy is trying to learn; living spies who infiltrate the enemy camp, gather information, and then return with that information; and dead spies, who are fed false information that is intended to be discovered by the enemy, spreading disinformation. Sun Tzu argues that intelligence is crucial to military success and that money spent on spies and intelligence gathering is money well invested. A general who lacks intelligence about the enemy is fighting blind. A general who has superior intelligence about the enemy knows where the enemy is, what the enemy's intentions are, how strong the enemy is, and what the enemy's weaknesses are. With this information, the general can make far better decisions. The final section discusses terrain and how the general should adapt his tactics to different types of terrain. Sun Tzu identifies different types of terrain open ground which favors armies that are mobile and well organized. Woody ground, which is difficult for large armies to maneuver in. Difficult ground, which is hard to traverse and requires careful planning. Enclosed ground, which is naturally defensible, but can become a trap if an army is surrounded. And distant ground, which is far from home and requires careful logistics, and discusses how a general should handle his forces in each type of terrain. Throughout all 13 sections, certain themes recur repeatedly, serving as the philosophical foundation of Sun Tzu's entire approach to warfare. The importance of knowledge is emphasized: constantly knowing yourself, knowing your enemy, knowing the terrain, and knowing the political situation. A general who lacks knowledge is forced to guess and to improvise, which leads to mistakes. A general who has superior knowledge can make better decisions. The importance of deception and keeping your true intentions hidden from the enemy is another recurring theme. In warfare, information is a form of power. If the enemy understands your plans, the enemy can prepare to counter your plans. If the enemy is confused about your plans, the enemy cannot effectively prepare a response. Therefore, a general should work to create this confusion through deception, through false information, through making his army appear to be weaker or stronger than it actually is, through appearing to intend one thing while actually intending another. The importance of discipline and training is another recurring theme. Discipline transforms a collection of individuals into a coordinated unit. Training develops the skills of individual soldiers and officers. An army with discipline and training can accomplish far more than an army without discipline and training, even if both armies have similar numbers and equipment. The importance of maintaining morale is another recurring theme. Soldiers with high morale will fight effectively and will follow orders willingly. Soldiers with low morale will fight ineffectively and may break and run at the first sign of difficulty. A general must work constantly to maintain the morale of his soldiers. The importance of adapting to circumstances rather than rigidly adhering to predetermined plans is another recurring theme. Warfare is inherently unpredictable. Plans must be flexible enough to adapt to unexpected developments. A general who is so committed to his original plan that he continues to pursue it even when circumstances change dramatically will eventually be defeated. What makes the art of war so remarkable and so enduring is not that any single idea in it is completely novel or unique. Rather, it is the systematic way that Sun Tzu brings together various ideas and principles into a coherent philosophy. It is the clarity and precision with which he expresses ideas that might otherwise be vague or confusing. It is the emphasis he places on rationality and analysis rather than on emotion and honor. It is his understanding that warfare is an instrument of policy, that war is fought to achieve political objectives, not as an end in itself, and that military operations should always be directed toward achieving political objectives, rather than toward acquiring glory or satisfying the honor code of warriors. Sun Tzu's emphasis on intelligence gathering was far ahead of his time. Most military commanders of his era, and for many centuries thereafter, gave insufficient attention to gathering information about the enemy. They relied on scouts and spies, certainly, but these were often considered supplementary to the main military operations rather than central to them. Sun Tzu understood that information is as important as physical military force, that a general who has superior intelligence about the enemy's position, intentions, and capabilities has an enormous advantage, and that investment in intelligence gathering is never wasted. Similarly, his emphasis on logistics and on the economic costs of warfare was far ahead of his time. He understood that an army is not just a collection of individual warriors, but is an organization that requires supplies, coordination, and careful planning. An army's ability to move, fight, and sustain itself depends on the quality of its logistical support. Many commanders focus on tactics and battlefield maneuvers while giving insufficient attention to logistics. But Sun Tzu understood that an army without adequate supplies, will be defeated regardless of the brilliance of its tactics. That the logistical tail that supports an army is as important as the soldiers who actually fight. His emphasis on psychological warfare and morale was also far ahead of his time. He understood that in many cases, a battle can be won or lost before the armies even engage in direct combat, through the psychological advantage that one side has over the other. An army that is confident, well-led, well-supplied, and motivated can accomplish feats that seem nearly impossible. An army that is demoralized, uncertain, poorly led, or poorly supplied will fail even if it has numerical advantage. His emphasis on the importance of terrain and positioning was far ahead of his time. He understood that the general who chooses the terrain and the time of battle has an enormous advantage. An army fighting in terrain that suits its composition and tactics, fighting at a time when it has the psychological advantage, can defeat an army that is forced to fight on unfavorable terrain at an unfavorable time. His emphasis on understanding the enemy was far ahead of his time. Many commanders of the ancient world thought primarily about their own army and gave relatively little thought to understanding the enemy. But Sun Tzu argued that understanding the enemy is equally important as understanding yourself. A general who knows the enemy but does not know himself will sometimes win and sometimes lose. A general who knows himself but does not know the enemy will be at a disadvantage. But a general who knows both himself and the enemy will always be victorious. After Sun Tzu completed The Art of War, his fate becomes obscure and uncertain. The historical records become vague, and different sources give different accounts. Some sources suggest that he continued to serve as a general for the state of Wu for many years after writing the book, leading campaigns and winning victories, and that he served with great distinction until his death. Other sources suggest that after achieving great military success, he withdrew from public life. Still other sources suggest that he left the state of Wu and traveled to other states, offering his services to other rulers. Some sources suggest that he died while still in active service. Others suggest that he lived to an advanced age and died peacefully in retirement. One particularly famous legend suggests that Sun Tzu, after achieving great military success and after seeing the state of Wu become powerful and respected, grew concerned about the king's ambitions and his apparent willingness to engage in endless warfare, to expand his territory even beyond what was necessary for security. The story suggests that Sun Tzu tried to counsel the king toward moderation and restraint, arguing that endless warfare would exhaust the state and its resources, and that the true art of war was to achieve your objectives with minimum cost, rather, and to pursue endless conquest. According to the story, the king, resenting this advice and wanting a general who would simply follow his commands without question or moral judgment, eventually dismissed Sun Tzu from his position. Sun Tzu then withdrew from public life, perhaps traveling to other states or simply living quietly in his home region, focusing on writing and philosophy rather than on military matters. Whether this story is literally true in every detail, or whether it is merely a legend constructed later by storytellers seeking to explain Sun Tzu's disappearance from the historical record, we cannot say with certainty. What is clear is that Sun Tzu did not leave us with a detailed autobiography or a clear historical record of his later life. Instead, he left us with his book, which has proven to be infinitely more valuable than any amount of biographical detail could ever be. The book is his legacy, his gift to posterity, his chance to share his wisdom with future generations of military leaders, strategists, and thinkers. The immediate impact of The Art of War was significant. Military commanders in Sun Tzu's era, and in the centuries that followed, studied his text and attempted to apply his principles. The book became recognized as a classic work of military strategy. It was taught to military officers training for command. It influenced how wars were planned and fought. In the centuries after Sun Tzu's death, when China eventually unified under the Qin dynasty, and then the Han dynasty. Military strategists continued to study and apply Sun Tzu's principles. Generals preparing for campaigns would read and reread Sun Tzu's work, searching for principles that could be applied to their particular situation. Military theorists would write commentaries on Sun Tzu's text, explaining what he meant and how his principles should be applied. Different schools of military thought emerged, each claiming to be the true heir to Sun Tzu's legacy. However, the influence of the art of war did not remain limited to China or to the ancient world. As Chinese civilization and culture gradually became known to the Western world over the centuries, the art of war was among the Chinese texts that attracted attention. Western scholars and military officers began to become aware of this remarkable ancient text and to recognize its value. The first Western translation was published in the early 18th century by a Jesuit missionary named Father Amiot, who translated The Art of War into French. This translation made the text available to Western military thinkers and helped to introduce Sun Tzu's ideas to a Western audience. Western military officers and scholars began to study the text and recognize its value. They recognized that this ancient Chinese text contained insights that were as relevant to 18th and 19th century warfare as they had been to ancient warfare. The principles of positioning, the importance of intelligence, the emphasis on psychological factors, these principles applied to European warfare, just as they had applied to Chinese warfare thousands of years earlier. European military academies began to include the art of war in their curricula, placing it alongside Western military classics by theorists like Clausewitz and other Western military thinkers. In the 19th century, when China came into greater contact with Western powers, and when Western powers began to establish influence and control in various parts of Asia, Western military strategists became increasingly aware of Sun Tzu's work. They began to see his ideas as representing a fundamentally different approach to warfare compared to Western military traditions. Where Western military theory often emphasized direct confrontation and the decisive battle, Sun Tzu emphasized indirect approach and achieving objectives without unnecessary fighting. Where Western theory emphasized the offense and the attack, Sun Tzu emphasized positioning and the achievement of psychological advantage. These different perspectives seem to represent fundamentally different ways of thinking about warfare. In the 20th century, military academies in Western nations began to include the art of war more systematically in their curricula. Military officers studied Sun Tzu's principles alongside their own Western military traditions. During World War II, military planners on all sides were aware of Sun Tzu's work, and some drew inspiration from his ideas. The wars of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, various regional conflicts, all saw military strategists attempting to apply Sun Tzu's principles. By the late 20th century, particularly after the Vietnam War and various other conflicts in which unconventional tactics and psychological factors seemed to play important roles, the art of war had transcended its original context as a work on military strategy and had become a text that was studied far beyond military circles. Business strategists and corporate executives began to recognize that many of Sun Tzu's principles could be applied to business competition. If warfare is about defeating competitors and achieving objectives with minimum resource expenditure, then business competition is in some ways similar to warfare. Business schools began to teach the art of war in management and strategy courses. Corporate leaders read Sun Tzu and attempted to apply his principles to business strategy. Concepts like knowing your enemy were adapted to mean understanding your business competitors and their strengths and weaknesses. Positioning was adapted to mean positioning your company in the market relative to competitors. Timing was adapted to mean timing your business moves to take advantage of market conditions. Psychological advantage was adapted to mean the brand recognition and reputation that could make customers prefer your products to competitors' products. Deception was adapted to mean strategic misdirection in business, making competitors uncertain about your intentions so they could not effectively respond to your moves. Sports coaches also began to recognize the relevance of Sun Tzu's principles. Coaches began to teach their athletes Sun Tzu's concepts about momentum, positioning, and the importance of mentally defeating the opponent before the competition even begins. Athletes studied Sun Tzu in an attempt to gain psychological advantage over their competitors. The idea that victory is won or lost before the actual competition begins that an athlete's mental state and confidence are crucial, that understanding the opponent's strengths and weaknesses is important. All of these ideas from Sun Tzu became incorporated into sports psychology and sports training. Today, The Art of War is one of the most widely read and most frequently cited texts in the world. It is available in numerous translations, ranging from scholarly translations intended for serious students to popular translations aimed at general readers. It has been adapted, reinterpreted, and applied to contexts that Sun Tzu himself probably never imagined. There are business strategy versions of The Art of War, with the military terminology adapted to business contexts. There are versions adapted for sports. There are versions adapted for personal development and self-improvement, with the military and competitive contexts adapted to personal life and relationships. The core principles that Sun Tzu articulated have proven to be remarkably flexible and applicable across an enormous range of contexts. Sun Tzu's books have been published in the millions of copies. His name appears constantly in business books, sports psychology books, military strategy books, and popular culture. Quotes from The Art of War are used constantly, sometimes accurately, sometimes with their meaning distorted or exaggerated. Business executives quote Sun Tzu to justify their business strategies. Military officers quote Sun Tzu to explain their military tactics. Coaches quote Sun Tzu to inspire their athletes. The ideas have become so absorbed into popular culture that many people are familiar with Sun Tzuan principles without necessarily knowing that they come from Sun Tzu. What accounts for this extraordinary longevity and continued relevance of Sun Tzu's CS work more than 2,000 years after it was written? Several factors seem important. First, Sun Tzu's work is based on principles that are fundamental to human competition and conflict, principles that are not limited to any particular era or context. The principles of positioning, of gathering information, of understanding your strengths and weaknesses, of achieving psychological advantage. These principles are relevant whether you are fighting a military war in ancient China, competing in business in modern America, competing in sports, or dealing with personal conflicts. The fundamental principles of competition are universal across time and across different domains. Second, Sun Tzu's writing is remarkably clear and concise. He expresses complex ideas in simple, elegant language. He uses metaphors and analogies that make his ideas accessible and memorable. He avoids unnecessary jargon or complex terminology. This clarity has allowed his work to survive translation into numerous languages without losing its essential meaning. The ideas are so clearly expressed that they translate well across different languages and different cultures. Third, Sun Tzu's work has an intellectual sophistication and philosophical depth that elevates it beyond mere technical advice. He is not simply telling you how to deploy cavalry or organize soldiers or conduct a siege. He is discussing the fundamental nature of conflict, the relationship between knowledge and power, the importance of adaptation and flexibility, the nature of victory and defeat. These deeper themes give his work a kind of timelessness. The specific military techniques described in The Art of War may be outdated. Modern warfare uses different weapons and different tactics than ancient warfare, but the principles underlying those techniques remain valid. Fourth, Sun Tzu's emphasis on avoiding unnecessary conflict and on achieving objectives with minimal cost is deeply appealing to rational actors in any era. Managers and leaders in any field can appreciate the wisdom of achieving your objectives efficiently and with minimal unnecessary expenditure of resources. A business manager can appreciate the wisdom of gaining market share without engaging in destructive price wars that hurt profitability. An athlete can appreciate the wisdom of defeating an opponent with a minimum of wasted effort. The fundamental principle achieving your objectives with minimum cost is universal. Perhaps most importantly, Sun Tzu's work offers a perspective on conflict and competition that values intelligence, strategy, and psychological factors over brute force and direct confrontation. This perspective has become increasingly relevant in an era when direct military confrontation is often too costly or too risky, when competition is often decided by information and positioning rather than by physical force. Sun Tzu's ancient wisdom seems surprisingly modern. In modern warfare, with advanced weapons that can kill from great distances, in modern business, where information and brand recognition matter more than physical product quantity, in modern sports, where psychology and strategy matter as much as physical skill, Sun Tzu's emphasis on these factors seems prophetic. The question of Sun Tzu's own life, of what kind of man he was, and what drove him to develop these revolutionary ideas about warfare, remains somewhat mysterious. We do not have detailed personal information about him. We do not know much about his family or his childhood beyond what can be inferred from the historical period in which he lived and from hints in historical documents. We do not know what his personal beliefs or values were beyond what we can infer from his writing. We do not know if he had friends or family relationships that were important to him. We do not know what his personal habits were or how he spent his leisure time. But from his writing, we can infer certain things about Sun Tzu's character and values. He clearly valued rationality and analysis over emotion and impulse. He valued the preservation of life and resources, suggesting a degree of humanistic concern about the costs of warfare. He valued knowledge and understanding, recognizing that intelligence is a form of power and that ignorance is a weakness. He valued discipline and order, understanding that organized groups can accomplish more than disorganized ones. He valued flexibility and adaptation, understanding that rigidity leads to failure while flexibility allows for success. He valued psychological insight, understanding the importance of morale and confidence. He valued efficiency and economy of effort, understanding that achieving your objectives with minimum waste is superior to achieving them with great waste. Sun Tzu seems to have been a man who thought deeply about the nature of warfare and conflict, who recognized that warfare was a complex endeavor that could be understood and mastered through study and practice, and who believed that a thinking general could accomplish far more than a general who simply followed tradition or relied on martial prowess and personal courage. He seems to have been confident in his abilities, perhaps overconfident, given the story of his demonstration with the concubines. But this confidence was based on a deep understanding of military principles rather than on mere arrogance or on blind faith in his own abilities. It is possible that Sun Tzu's ultimate withdrawal from public life and his emphasis in the art of war on achieving victory without fighting reflected a deeper philosophical perspective about the limitations and costs of warfare. Perhaps as he aged and reflected on his career, on the campaigns he had fought on the soldiers, he had seen die on the resources expended on the suffering caused by war, he came to believe that even victorious warfare carries significant costs, and that the best general is the one who wins by avoiding the necessity of fighting. This perspective, expressed in his writing, has resonated across centuries and cultures, speaking to something deep in human nature, the recognition that conflict is costly, and that avoiding unnecessary conflict is wise. The question of Sun Tzu's death and the date of his death remains uncertain, lost in the fog of history. Different historical sources give different accounts. Some suggest he died in the state of Wu, either while still serving in the military or after his retirement. Others suggest that he may have traveled to other states seeking patronage or new opportunities. Still others suggest that the historical Sun Tzu may have been a composite figure created from the stories of multiple military strategists from the Warring States period, that the man we know as Sun Tzu may be a legendary figure rather than a historical one. However, the most common view among historians is that Sun Tzu was indeed a historical figure, probably born in the state of Wu in the 6th century before Christ, who served as a military general and strategist, who achieved significant military successes, and who wrote or had written The Art of War during his lifetime or immediately after his death. Regardless of the precise details of Sun Tzu's life and death, what is absolutely clear is the impact of his work. The art of war has influenced military thinking for more than 2,000 years. It has been studied by generals and military strategists across numerous cultures and eras. It has been applied to contexts far beyond its original military context. It remains one of the most important and influential texts ever written about strategy, competition, and conflict. Its influence extends far beyond military matters into business, sports, psychology, and philosophy. The core message of Sun Tzu, the idea that has resonated across centuries and cultures, is this: winning is not primarily about brute force or direct confrontation. Instead, winning is about superior knowledge, superior positioning, superior psychological advantage, and superior strategic thinking. The best victories are those achieved with the least cost and the least violence. The best general is the one who understands that warfare is an instrument for achieving political objectives and who uses it efficiently and effectively for that purpose. The best strategist is one who can see several moves ahead, who understands how different actions will create different consequences, and who positions himself and his forces to exploit these consequences. This message, expressed more than 2,000 years ago in the context of ancient Chinese warfare, has proven to apply across an enormous range of human competition and conflict. Whether you are fighting a military war, competing in business, competing in sports, or competing in any other domain of human life, Sun Tzu's principles offer guidance that remains relevant and powerful. Know yourself and know your competitors. Gather information and intelligence. Position yourself to exploit your advantages and the weaknesses of your competitors. Maintain discipline and order in your organization. Build and maintain morale. Adapt to changing circumstances rather than rigidly adhering to predetermined plans. Seek to achieve your objectives efficiently and with minimal unnecessary cost. Above all, think strategically about the long-term consequences of your actions rather than focusing only on immediate short-term victory. Sun Tzu's life, mysterious and obscure as it is, serves as a reminder that profound impact and lasting influence do not necessarily require a long life lived constantly in the public eye. Sun Tzu may have served as a general for only a relatively short period in the grand span of history. He may have lived in relative obscurity after his retirement from public service. He may have died without great fanfare or public recognition. He may have been forgotten entirely if not for the book he left behind. But through his writing, through the wisdom he captured in The Art of War, he has influenced millions of people across centuries and cultures. His ideas have shaped how wars have been fought, how businesses have competed, how athletes have approached their sport. His legacy is perhaps the greatest that any human can achieve, to have influenced the thinking and actions of countless others long after one's own death. Sun Tzu remains relevant because his understanding of conflict and strategy cuts to something fundamental about human nature and human competition. We still need to understand ourselves and our competitors. We still benefit from having superior information. We still want to achieve our objectives efficiently. We still recognize the importance of positioning and timing. We still understand that psychological factors matter. We still value discipline and organization. We still know that adaptation and flexibility are necessary for success. The context changes. Modern warfare is very different from ancient Chinese warfare. Modern business is very different from ancient military campaigns, but the fundamental principles underlying Sun Tzu's teachings remain constant. The art of war stands as a monument to the power of clear thinking, disciplined analysis, and the capacity to see beneath surface appearances to the fundamental principles that underlie human competition and conflict. Sun Tzu may have faded from history, but his wisdom remains vibrant and alive, consulted as frequently today as it was in ancient China, applied to contexts he could never have imagined, but always containing the same core truths about strategy, knowledge, and the nature of human competition. In this way, Sun Tzu achieved a victory that transcends any military victory he might have won on a battlefield. He achieved victory in the realm of ideas and in the hearts and minds of readers across the world. His words live on, guiding leaders and strategists, challenging conventional wisdom, and reminding us that true victory often comes not from direct confrontation, but from superior knowledge, superior positioning, and superior strategic thinking. This is the lasting legacy of Sun Tzu, the ancient warrior philosopher whose insights continue to echo through the ages.